JJK just surprised everyone in chapter 239, with the unlikely showdown between the brain himself Kenjaku and the not so funny guy Takaba. Unfortunately though, this fight might end with Kenny obtaining one of the most broken curse techniques that we have ever seen. Maybe even putting him on the level of Sukuna himself. A lot of people were pissed off that we spent this chapter away from the main action where everyone thought that we'd finally see Yuji versus Sukuna, and also, finally get to see Yuji's massive new abilities, and that ended up not happening. But if I'm being honest, this is probably the most awesome secondary fight that I could have thought of. Like, we could have easily gotten another Yuji versus the clever grasshopper guy scenario, you know what I mean? Like a pretty lame fight. But we didn't. Believe it or not, Kenjaku is actually the perfect first and likely only major fight for Takaba here, because Takaba's curse technique is in some dire need of explanation. After all, in the world of JJK, strong curse techniques and abilities are usually balanced with hyper-specific restrictions and conditions that need to be met. This way, it never really seems like an ass pull when we're introduced to a character with an insane new power. It's usually heavily restricted or has some very special conditions. Gege's really good at making the most broken abilities make sense within the confines of the power system of JJK. But with the way things work in this story, the more overpowered the ability, the more complicated and nuanced the mechanics of that ability usually is. Perfect example, think of Hikari with his idle death gamble curse technique and how it pretty much makes him immortal. Super powerful, sure, but the strangely complex explanation as to how it all works is enough to even make the creator of Hunter x Hunter, Yoshihiro Togashi, blush. And that guy comes up with some seriously complex abilities. Now just imagine the possible mental gymnastics we're gonna have to do once it comes time for Takaba's curse technique to be explained. At the moment, all we know about his curse technique is what was explained in chapter 173. Here we find out that Takaba's curse technique is called Comedian. When he comes up with something that he's certain will be funny, it becomes a reality. It's even said that it's a curse technique that could oppose Gojo himself, highlighting just how out of this world this ability really is. But apparently Takaba is utterly clueless as to how it all works. So rounding back to what I said earlier where Kenny is the perfect matchup for Takaba, I say this because with how strong his curse technique seems to be, there's likely some super nuanced and complicated mechanics behind how it all works. That's just the way that techniques work in this series, and who better to understand and explain a technique as potentially complex as Takaba's than Kenjaku, the mad genius. With over 1,000 years of experience in the Jujutsu world, there's probably nobody better than Kenny to give us a nice breakdown on all those little details. And by the time that he realizes just how broken of a technique Comedian really is, there is a chance that he'll try to claim it for himself. Yeah, that's a scary thought, I know. So how did a failed comedian with cringy puns end up with a technique that could in theory put an end to the likes of Sukuna and Gojo? And how could it end up in Kenjaku's hands? Well, I gotta give it to you, buddy, that is a damn good question. So I'm gonna do my best to give you as damn good of an answer as I possibly can. If you can't tell already, I'm going to be showing my face in videos now once in a while. Gonna hop in here and there, say some things, do some things, but you don't really care about that, right? Let's just move on with the video. Fumihiko Takaba is a 35-year-old failing comedian when we first meet him in the manga. He finishes up another poorly received comedy set with someone backstage telling him that he isn't cut out for this line of work, so he should just quit. A friend in the room, however, tells him that he doesn't need to be funny to be a successful comedian. He goes on to say that there are two types of successful comedians out there, those that are funny and those that think that they're funny. He then asks Takaba which type he is, to which he responds by saying he's probably 50-50, but he quickly corrects himself and says that he's more like 70-30. When this chapter first released, many people thought that this 70-30 comment might have been a reference to Nanami's curse technique, where he can divide his target into 10 lines and forcibly create a weak spot at the ratio point of 7-3. Many thought that this was Gege telling us that Takaba somehow inherited this curse technique, since he was soon shown to be one of the awakened sorcerers that were forcibly entered into the Culling game. Hold on to that 70-30 comment though, because it actually plays a big role in the manga later, and a lot of people don't notice it. Staying on the topic of the Culling game for now, when Kenjaku absorbed and stole Mahito's curse technique, he used idle transfiguration to remotely awaken two types of sorcerers all around Japan. He does this by rewiring their brains to be capable of Jujutsu. The first type are people who ingested cursed objects, similar to Yuji Itadori. The second type are people who gained curse techniques despite having brains that were meant to be non-sorcerers. Think Junpei Yoshino. Takaba ended up being the second type, meaning that he retained his own consciousness when his brain got rewired and he awakened a curse technique that fit his personality. This is something important to note because before the Culling games, curse techniques either manifested naturally or were inherited through blood lineage. In either case, it was never a condition for these techniques to reflect the personality of the person they manifested in. This seems to have changed with the second type of awakened sorcerers like Takaba and Higuruma. These new awakened sorcerer techniques seem to follow rules similar to Nen abilities in Hunter x Hunter, where the will and the personality of the Nen user creates their own unique Nen ability. This is why Takaba's technique is called comedian and why the premise of it makes sense, where anything he imagines to be funny becomes reality. So we have a pretty good idea of why he has this particular curse technique, but how does it work exactly? Well, although we probably won't know the finer details on how this ability can be so broken until Kenjaku gives us a good old info dump about it once he figures it out, in the few fights Takaba's been a part of, we've actually learned quite a bit. When he bursts onto the scene during Megumi's fight with Reggie Star and Iori Hazunoki, he takes a blast point blank to the head and comically points out that it did no damage, even though we can clearly see blood gushing out of his head. This considerable damage was something that he technically allowed to happen for the sake of the joke. We know this because we later see that multiple equally powerful explosions do absolutely nothing but like mess up his hair a little bit, but that's honestly it. There's no damage to his body, there's no damage to his costume even. Speaking of his costume, in this same chapter, Takaba also points out that his costume is based on the superhero who first got him to laugh his guts out. This is him actually referring to a real life character called Centerman. This is a character that comes from a Japanese comedy sketch show called Adventures of a Laughing Dog. I tried to say the actual Japanese name of the show when I first recorded this, but I sounded like an idiot, so yeah, English version it is. In the particular sketch that Centerman is in, it's about a superhero who believes splitting things up 50-50 isn't necessarily equal and that 70-30 is more fair. I don't know what's so funny about that, but this is where the 70-30 comment he made when he was first introduced comes into play. See, it all makes sense now. The more you learn, right? Well, in his fight with Hazunoki, he gives him a good old jump kick to the face that sends him straight through a building. This is when Reggie notices that his cursed energy output increased dramatically for a brief moment. That means that when Takaba gears up for an attack that's attached to a cringy pun he thinks is funny, that automatically meets the conditions his cursed technique has, and it briefly makes it to where Takaba gains the necessary cursed energy to perform the attack the way it's imagined in his head. Kenjaku alludes to this premise in chapter 239, when he tries to kill Takaba on sight only to realize that it did no damage at all. He then realizes that it wasn't that his attack didn't work, it was somehow forced not to work. This means Takaba's body produced the cursed energy it needed to completely negate the attack and allow him to have the comical little quip that comes next. So pretty much every impressive feat is going to be attached to a pun. Simple yet insanely broken. Again, the mechanics behind comedian are likely going to be complex, but the applications of it seem to not be that complicated, which should make you understand how truly insane this technique really is. In the hands of someone as simple and kind as Takaba, it's honestly pretty harmless in the grand scheme of things because he generally seems like someone that would like to avoid killing, even though he states himself that he's an old school comedian that's pro-violence. However, in the hands of someone like Kenjaku, who wants to do things like merging all of Japan's humans with Tengen to create some cursed kaiju abomination for the simple reason of just wanting to see what happens, it's a technique that could straight up mean the end of any hope our main cast has of defeating the bad guys. I mean, Kenjaku even says himself as he's fantasizing about how the merged cursed abomination is going to look, he wonders if it'll take the shape of a funny face and seems genuinely amused by that idea. Super creepy dude. If he had Takaba's ability while having that thought, he could have made it happen right there and then and bypassed all the extra Culling game steps that he needed to make it happen. JJK would be over right there and then, boom, gone. And now this absolutely crazy strong ability is falling into the palm of his hands in chapter 239. Here it seems like Kenny and Takaba are about to have an all-out showdown for the ages. And although Takaba seems to have the capabilities of beating Kenjaku, since it was said that he could even rival Gojo with his technique, it's really unlikely that he's actually going to win. After all, we have to remember that Kenjaku is pretty much Okotsu's final fight. The story's been setting this up since Okotsu got reintroduced into the manga, so it doesn't make sense that the brain gets defeated before he gets there, right? They gotta have their final showdown. That means that Takaba is either simply a distraction that'll let Akotsu and the others bypass the barrier Kenny has set up to detect and deter them, or in the worst case scenario, Kenjaku finds a way to beat and kill Takaba. If the latter happens and Kenjaku gains full understanding of the technique before killing him, he might have time to swap his brain into his body. And if that happens, I don't see anyone, including Sukuna, being able to stop what this new Kenjaku would be capable of. Thanks to my channel members, love ya.